Hey everyone, it's Nikachu, and today we are going to take a look at Living End in Modern. That's right, that shitty graveyard deck that no one gave the time or day. Well, the other graveyard decks, Grishlebrand, Dredge, they looked down on this graveyard deck. It wasn't worthy enough of being tier 1 in Modern, but all those other graveyard decks got their cards banned out of Modern. So be careful who you make fun of in high school, because it's Living End's time to shine. But not just any traditional Living End deck. No, we're not going Jund. We are going Rug. This deck got major upgrades thanks to Modern Horizons. Well, how does Living End work, you might ask? Well, let me show you. The strategy to this deck is to cycle a bunch of creature cards into your graveyard and then reanimate them all onto the battlefield at once. What are the creatures we're going to cycle? It's going to be Architects of Will, Curator of Mysteries, Glass Dust Hulk, Street Wraith, Windcaller Aven, Striped Riverwinder, and Waker of Waves. Now, how are we going to reanimate them all onto the battlefield? We are going to use the namesake card, Living End. Each player exiles all cards from their graveyard, then sacrifices all creatures they control, then puts all cards they exiled this way onto the battlefield. So it might sound a little messy, but basically you take all the creature cards in the graveyard, you put them off to the side, then you wipe away everything on the battlefield, destroy them all. Then those creatures that got set aside in exile, they go back onto the battlefield, and boom! You've got a battlefield and your opponent probably doesn't. But how do we cast Living End? It's got a suspend 3 for black, black, and 2 generic. Honestly, if you're suspending this card, you're probably fucked. We're gonna cheat the card in play with cascade spells like Violent Outburst for a red or green and generic. We cascade, and there are no other cards in our deck that have a mana value of 2 or less. They will directly find our Living End. Don't forget that Violent Outburst does have the text, creatures you control get +1/+0 until end of turn. Could be some extra damage you need when you go for a lethal attack. Now, the other card that we're going to use to cascade into our Living End is an upgrade thanks to Modern Horizons 2 Shardless Agent. For a blue, green, and 1 generic, it's a 2/2 creature. You cast this card, cascade triggers, Living End resolves first. You get all your creatures on the battlefield, then the Shardless Agent resolves. You got an extra 2/2 creature on the battlefield. Fantastic. And what makes this deck's namesake card so powerful is that it wipes your opponent's board and then builds your own. You can play Living End like almost a pseudo control deck. Living End is like a real life example of those cartoons where someone's playing a game, someone's losing, and they say, hey, look over there. And then in the meantime, they're switching around the pieces so that they have the winning position, their opponent's losing. This is what Living End is all about. So in the cartoon, they're cheating, and as far as I'm concerned, Living End player is cheating. This is a complete BS interaction. Your cascade spells directly tutor for a board wipe. And the crazy thing is, those fuckers can combo off at instant speed. Now that's what makes this deck so much more dangerous, because this is a blue Living End deck, because they take advantage of Force of Negation. Alright, so Violent Outburst at the end of your turn, Cascade, triggers, finds the Living End, and now if you want to interact with my Living End whatsoever, you're gonna, bam, get hit with the Force of Negation. So Force of Negation says, if it's not your turn, you may exile a blue card from your hand rather than pay this spell's mana cost. Counter target non-creature spell. If that spell is countered this way, exile it instead of putting it into its owner's graveyard. You see, they worded Force of Negation in a way so that it could only be used for good, not for bad, because how on earth is a combo player going to combo off on the opponent's turn? Well, these fucking Living End decks found a way to do it. So I think the Living End archetype is the first legitimate deck to turn Force of Negation to Force of Evil. And when you go moist, you get really good interactive cards. Brazen Bar is a fantastic card, double blue 1 generic for a 3/1 flyer if you need it, but the point is you get to use Petty Theft, a blue and 1 generic, an instant adventure, return target non-land permanent an opponent controls to its owner's hand. This has multiple purposes in this archetype. First off, you can't hit the Petty Theft off of any of your Cascade spells. It's just going to pass right through it. But you can use the Petty Theft either to slow your opponent down so that you get yourself in a position to combo off, or bounce the interaction that they might have that interacts with your combo. Eldrazi-tron, you bastard, for playing those main deck Chalices, because Chalice on 0, it would normally hose the Living End, but not today, because Brazen Borrower has some new plans. Petty Theft the damn thing to your hand, and then combo off on turn. That Eldrazi-tron player is not going to know what hit them. The advantage to Living End is that attacking their graveyard does not work in the same traditional fashion as other graveyard decks. Take Grafdigger's Cage, for example. For 1 generic, creature cards in graveyards and libraries can't enter the battlefield. Players can't cast spells from graveyards or libraries. Now, against your traditional graveyard decks, this card basically says, do not pass go, do not collect $200, go directly to Grafdigger's Cage, and don't forget to sell your deck to pay for the hotel on that shit. But Living End doesn't pay the rent because they run the streets. You see, Living End specifically says that each player exiles all creature cards from their graveyard, then sacrifices all creatures they control, then puts all cards exiled this way directly onto the battlefield. You see, Grafdigger's Cage just locks up creatures that were going directly from the graveyard to the battlefield, but Living End actually exiles them first, then returns the exiled creatures to the battlefield, so Grafdigger's Cage has no power here. Now let's say you do have the graveyard under control. You're playing Relic of Progenitus, Surgical Extraction, Tormod's Crypt, looping it with Lurrus, and all of a sudden the creatures in the graveyard, they're suffering, they have nowhere to go. This deck actually has a pretty damn good plan B. You fucking cast the creatures. Have you heard of Honest Magic? No? Well, maybe you should pick it up once in a while. That's right. Have you heard of ever just playing lands, tapping them for mana, and putting a 4/4 body on the battlefield? No? Well, maybe you should try it once in a while. Sometimes these games go really long because your opponent is very patiently trying to play around the combo, but if the game goes too long, you make too many land drops, all of a sudden, you're putting a Curator of Mysteries in play. You're putting Brazen Borrower on the battlefield. You're gonna hardcast a Windcaller Aven. You're gonna get a Striped Riverwinder in play. And what the hell is anyone gonna do about a 5/5 hexproof creature? This is practically a secret weapon for the Living End deck. Have you ever seen Dredge cast their creatures? I'm sure you have. Stinkweed Imp, Golgari Thug. It's embarrassing. It's an absolute laughing stock. And the sideboard's beautiful. It's playing cards that, of course, cannot get hit by the Cascade spells. So we're gonna run Leyline of the Void. That's right, the enchantment that's going to completely annihilate our opponent's graveyard while leaving our own graveyard intact if we're up against the graveyard decks. Leyline of Sanctity. Oh, you've got some hand disruption? Well, why don't you Thoughtseize yourself for once? Then we've got Foundation Breaker, new card from Modern Horizons, 2/2 elemental creature that can be evoked into play for a green and 1 generic. When Foundation Breaker enters the battlefield, you may destroy target artifact or enchantment. Now, the artifact destruction creature usually in the sideboard for the Living End decks was Ingot Chewer, but I do believe that this is a great replacement to the Ingot Chewer, perhaps an upgrade, because not only does it deal with the artifacts that you might have to deal with, whether it be Tormod's Crypt, Relic of Progenitus, Soul Guide Lantern, but also the enchantments your opponent might be playing. Your opponent's Rest in Peace, their Leyline of the Void. Suddenly, Living End has access to artifact and enchantment destruction. And the Mystical Dispute is such a bitch to deal with. It's a 3-mana card, so it bypasses the Cascade rule. But the deal is, it can help protect their combo against other counterspell decks. This spell costs 2 less to cast if it targets a blue spell. Well, that's fantastic. Against other counterspell decks, you get to cast this thing for a single blue counter target spell unless its controller pays 3. So you better believe that this Living End deck is definitely very well built to beat up the other opposing counterspell decks. Usually control decks, they're good against these combo decks. They are supreme. because of their counter magic, but between Mystical Dispute and Force Negation, they're not. They're not that great. And it's weird for me to say, but I think Living End is hands down the best graveyard deck in the modern metagame today. But like all graveyard decks, they might be the hot thing today, but they might be horseshit tomorrow. So if you want to take this out for a spin while it's the hot thing on the block, you can do so with Mana Traders, the premier place to rent Magic cards online. It's also an excuse to not actually buy Force of Negation because it costs an arm and a leg. You can support the channel using my Mana Traders link in the description below, or save 15% off your first 2 months using my coupon code Nikachu. Well, that's my video for today. Shout out to Sodak, who worked really hard on this archetype to make it powerful and popular. Smash like for bullshit Cascade decks, and also don't forget to subscribe to my channel, or you're gonna get embarrassed by Strike Riverwinder.